Good morning. I'm going to talk about the concept of organisational goods, in particular of knowledge as an organisational good. I'm Helen Verran and I'm from the Northern Institute at Charles Darwin University, and I work in a section called Contemporary Indigenous Knowledge and Governance. And in beginning, I want to say how grateful I am to have this opportunity. A great deal of organisation has gone into making this lecture possible. And I want to begin by thanking everybody who's been involved in the Northern Institute and in St Andrews. Now, just let me stay with the organisation that's gone into this event. What we're doing here is organising the organisational good of talking about organisational knowledge as an organisational good. So, as you see, something funny happens when you put goods and organisation together and try to name explicitly what it is we're doing. And I'll come back to that. That slight sense of oddness. For me, it's a slight sense that organisational goods starts looking back at me saying, yes, really? What are you doing here? So it's oddly self-referential. Now, why is that? And that's what I'll consider in a minute. So why do I want to consider organisational goods? I want to think about it as a means of being neither and both, optimistic and pessimistic about possibilities for institutional change. Someone less charitable and using less fancy language might say, oh, it's just a displacement activity that those academics get up to. Maybe it is. But I think by giving time to this displacement activity of thinking about organisational goods is worth it in the situation the world is in. So, organisational goods. There's a sense in which all goods are organisational. A good in itself, and that's a concept that goes back to Aristotle, is something pursued actively and collectively for its own sake. So an organisational good is, in a sense, that there's a redundancy in it, because goods can't be without being organised. Goods are organised. They're done collectively, and they're agreed on as worthy, as good collectively. So this is why I want to begin by suggesting that the concept of goods, as distinct from bads, although both goods and bads, goes a bit odd when you set it about with organisation. So let me just repeat what I said in beginning in trying to name explicitly what we're doing here. What we're doing here is the outcome of collective organisation. Much organisation has gone into this event. And the event is a contribution to organising the organisational good of talking together about organisational knowledge. So you're repeating goods and organisation, and they're modifying and they're qualifying, and you don't know what's what. So it's the tangling that I think makes goods go a bit odd when set about with organisation. Because goods are necessarily collective. So what I've been trying to do here is to demonstrate, to show you a phenomenon that I've been familiar with since about the 1980s, really, and I think I've got a bit addicted to it. And it's a phenomenon I call ontological disconcertment. One of the things that happens, ontological disconcertment is a bit like having a concept look back at you, as if to say, what are you staring at? I've tried to begin by demonstrating that to you, to trying to make you feel it, and feel our way into it. So, recognising this concept of this phenomenon of ontological disconcertment, I want to suggest that a conceptual phrase like organisational goods, is something that we should learn to cultivate as a companion. So recognising that they have agency in the here and now, they make us feel something, they seem to call us out. What do you mean by that? And they also seem to inhabit us because we're inhabiting them. So I want to recognise this sort of two-wayness between concepts and their knowers by suggesting that we should learn to think of our concepts not only as abstract entities located in our wonderfully trained minds, but also as companions in the messy here and now of going on doing an organisation. So we admit that we're not quite entirely comfortable in the presence of a concept because the thing about companions is you don't always choose them, and sometimes you don't even like them. It's a bit like relatives and sometimes even colleagues. You go on together in the best way you can, recognising differences as companions. And I'm inspired by Donna Haraway here. Donna Haraway in the 1980s wrote about companion cyborgs, decidedly discomforting figures. And then later on, much more recently, she wrote about companion species. So I'm, if you like, adding to the family of non-human companions by suggesting concepts, and that we need to cultivate the idea that concepts can be companions. Now recently I've been trying to come to terms with a concept with which I, despite working with it for a number of years, I'm still very uncomfortable in its presence, and I think I really don't like it. It's called environmental services or ecosystem services, and it replaces, in policy, it replaces the natural science concept, with which I do feel some close companionship, of ecosystems, natural ecosystems. So I've been trying to cultivate a relationship, if you like, with environmental services for some years now. I'm still having trouble with it. Okay, so I've tried to demonstrate ontological disconcertment for you, and I've tried to explain that a way to learn to, I've proposed that a way to learn to nurture ontological disconcertment is to begin to think of our concepts as companions. So really, this lecture is mostly about organisational goods as slightly disconcerting. So I want to promote the idea that ontological disconcertment is an organisational good, and that much organisational learning, or at least some organisational learning, should be devoted to nurturing this capacity of experiencing ontological disconcertment in organisations. Okay, so to begin to explain to you what ontological disconcertment is, I have to go a step back and introduce you to the idea of knowledge practices. Now, knowledge practices, it seems a very uncontroversial idea, and in pedagogy, this notion of knowledge practices has been around a while, but I give knowledge practices a very different spin than the sort of seemingly everyday way in which the idea of, or the term, knowledge practices presents itself. I want to suggest that organisations, in thinking about their knowledge and learning, should really begin to think about their knowledge practices in epistemic ways. And I want to promote the idea that organisations are clots of organisational practices. I've just lost my point in the slides. Okay, so if we think of our organisations as knowledge practices, we can begin to get a handle on ontological disconcertment. So what are knowledge practices? This is knowledge practices understood epistemically. And this sees that an organisation, a working organisation, an organisation that opens its doors and which people walk in and sit down at their offices and talk to each other and work on computers and send emails and so on, working organisations that have outcomes and planning sessions and policy and so on, actually are clots of collective practices. Any organisation, including the organisation of Charles Darwin University or St Andrews University, their being is as answers to 5 epistemic questions. Now these are both not new, but also they are a bit new. These questions about knowledge and how it's practiced as an epistemic issue go back a long way, of course. As most things, they go back to Aristotle and his colleagues in the academy. So this approach sees that the working of an organisation is collectively enacted answers to 5 epistemic questions. So as an organisation goes on, it answers these questions. It's never posed them to itself, but it's answering them anyway. And so it's answering the question of what is known, which is the old word of ontology. It's answering the question, how is it known, which is the old word of method. which is really just making a map of where we've been. It's the rather serious word of how do we know? We know epistemology, which terrifies graduate students. But it's also how do we, or why is it worthy? So this is a question, or why is it value? Why is it a good? This is actually an epistemic question goes under the term axiology, axos meaning worthy. But I want to add a fifth one, which classically hasn't been included in these 5 ways of describing the doing of knowledge. Generating knowledge, the practices of generating knowledge answers these questions, which are the knowledge-focused questions. And so the fifth one is, how are knowers figured? And I think this is really important, and it's really important to try to bring up and foreground at the moment, because I think as our governments become neoliberalised, one of the epistemic consequences of this is that answers to the question, how are knowers figured, is being changed. And this actually goes back to Foucault and his lectures in the 1970s, when he said that homo politicus is being replaced by homo economicus, using Latin and demonstrating an epistemic practice in the process, of course. So in thinking about ontological disconcertment, of course, we need to answer. The problem is with these questions is you can't begin to talk about answers to one without talking about answers to all of them, but I'm going to do that anyway. And I'm going to begin with the first one, what is known? And I think that as part of organisational learning, we need to take seriously the need to nurture ontological disconcertment. In other words, we need to learn in our organisations to take seriously the question of what is known here? What are our companion concepts actually helping us to know collectively? So this is why I'm suggesting that thinking of concepts as a companion is a first step along the way. So thinking of the question, what is known, I'm going to tell 3 stories of 3 different organisations where the question of what is known in the ordinary everyday working of this organisation had to be, or got seriously disrupted by concepts that looked back and actively disrupted the organisation as it tried to go on. So I'm going to tell 3 stories. And my first story is about meeting a disconcerting number in Nigerian classrooms. So I apologise for the poor images here. These are photos that were developed in Nigeria many years ago and have faded. But what became obvious to me as I worked in those classrooms is, and I was working as a teacher educator in maths and science education. The function of the school is to, as an organisation, is to teach children to read and to count and to become familiar with the workings of numbers and so on. And what I realised is that the school, as an organisation, could not recognise the numbers that were coming to life in its classrooms. And the reason I could recognise this is because I, as a teacher-educator, could see that it worked fine and that the students and the teachers knew them, but I could not make sense of them. And this was very disconcerting to find numbers as ontologically different, but still working. So it took me a long while to work out how to cope with this interrupting number. What do I do with this interrupting number? What does a Nigerian school teaching Yoruba-speaking children whose English is still coming along, and probably rather slowly, how does a Nigerian school as an organisation deal with the disconcertment or the multiplicity of numbers that it has to deal with? Because the formal curriculum, which comes of course from standard elementary school education, has one form of number in it. Yet I discovered that coming to life in Yoruba language and with Yoruba numeration, particularly in the forms of predication that hold in Yoruba language, the numbers that the children were familiar with were different. But even more striking is that the children could translate. They could translate ontologically between the number that I knew as a Westerner and the number that they knew probably as they sold tomatoes in their family's stall after school. They knew how to translate, and even more remarkable, 15% of them, I did a huge study so I know it's 15% using a number, could actually tell me a story of how they translated. They said, well, if you see it in Yoruba, it's like an event, okay? I just pour the peanuts, and you watch me pour the peanuts, and it makes the cone, and you know how full the cone should be, and then that is a unit of peanuts. But if I think of peanuts in the way that I'm learning to think about things in English, then I might think of the peanuts as a mass, as weighing the same as this. And then they could tell me that, well, when you think of peanuts this way, you have to watch the event. And when you think of peanuts that way, what you really have to do is watch the beam balance, so that they could bodily tell me how to translate between that these numbers were different. They'd laugh at me if I asked them they were different. Of course they're different. You know, how could anybody ask such a silly question? So this was my first meeting of ontological disconcertment. And since then, I've been promoting the idea that Nigerian or organisations should learn to take on board ontological disconcertment. Okay, now, so my second story, and this also comes out of my experience a little later than my experience of teaching in Nigeria, working as a teacher-educator in the organisations of Nigerian schools back in Australia, working this time as a consultant, sometimes called a consultant philosopher, in an organisation that it's an Aboriginal organisation, a Yolngu Aboriginal organisation, and it's committed to both using Yolngu knowledge practices to manage its lands. It's an environmental NGO, one of the early environmental NGOs. And it's committed to using its own knowledge practices and Yolngu Aboriginal Australians are pretty clear on what knowledge practices are. Well, I can have a very nice conversation about ontological and epistemological practices in Yolngu ways of doing things. But in this organisation, they're keen to also work with scientists, partly because working with scientific concepts can be very useful. The idea of endangered species, for example, is one concept that this environmental organisation is really keen on, if you like, bringing into the Yolngu world. So this is an organisation that is committed to developing, in this case, practices of land management through setting fire to areas of land about this time of the year, as a way of, it's a form of, well, it's a bit like irrigation, except using fire rather than water, to burn off after the wet season and prepare for the new growth in the cooler months of the dry season. And this is a workshop, and these are images that were taken in a workshop, and what we discovered, and I was by this time really quite keen on ontological disconcertment. So I was trying to foreground, not very effectively I don't think as a facilitator, but trying to foreground ontological disconcertment both for the Yolngu Aboriginal landowners but more particularly for the scientists. The environmental scientists could not, didn't really have the capacity to take on board the notion that fires could be ontologically distinct entities, and that what we were doing in this workshop, where a group of environmental scientists were invited to learn from Aboriginal landowners as they fired a particular area, was to introduce scientists to this different sort of fire, a concept of fire as land management fire that is thoroughly companionable to Yolngu, and their youngsters are trained to make firing as a concept companionable right from a very early age, and have cigarette lighters put into their hands. And then they're told where if you light a fire here, the fire will flow up there. This becomes part of a family picnic, as I discovered, much to my amazement. In this workshop, in this organisation, which on the one side is committed to, knows about ontological disconcertment. If you've been colonised and tried to work with your colonisers for 200 years, you do learn a bit about ontological disconcertment. So on the one hand, we have people who are thoroughly familiar with the phenomenon, and on the other, people who it's really just beyond their ken, you might say. What happened? There actually are two workshops illustrated in these photos. We see an elder who has just given a lecture in Yolngu to a group of assembled scientists, and because he thought it really wasn't appropriate for to try to drag the whole cohort of scientists around as he lit the fires. He just asked my friend, who was the workshop coordinator, a fairly famous Australian, and me, who sort of uninvited hopped in the back, to just go around and to light all the fires. This, of course, completely outraged the scientists, who got really furious because they took me aside and said, "We came here to make empirical observations on people lighting fires, and yet you allowed the main firelighter to go off and light fires without us being present. So how can we make empirical observations on the firing practices when people talk in languages we can't understand and go off and do it without us?" So it prompted real anger on the part of these scientists, who felt that they'd made a considerable sacrifice in coming here and yet were being denied, or their interests were not taken seriously enough. So this took quite a bit of papering over, and in fact it was the second little disaster that had already happened within half a day. But it did go on. I actually explained to the old man and to the facilitators and to the youngsters, who really had planned to go off and do it, as that they would actually have to take the scientists along with them. So this caused a lot of reorganising, because to take a group of booted and hatted khaki scientists along a track is a different matter to sort of a group of boys going along it. So it turned into a very difficult day, and I certainly went home with a headache. So these are stories of ontological disconcertment in organisations that I feel need to be committed to recognising ontological disconcertment, recognising its value, and working out how to make something good with it. Now, the third one is actually a fairly recent ontological disconcertment, and this happened in northern Norway. This is a road that goes, it's part of the road that goes from Tromsø to Alta, right on the Tromsø side really. So it's going down this valley, and this is a road that has been made and remade and remade. Road engineers are really, really important in northern Norway. As you might imagine, now this valley is particularly subject to avalanches, and people are regularly killed in the winter driving along this road. So the road engineers have made it and remade it several times now, trying to get a route to avoid the avalanches. And so on. But very curiously, in this, the most dangerous road in Norway, there's a rock. There's a rock right in the road, and in fact, the road has been made to go around the rock. So as you drive by, the land is completely clear, and then there's this rock, and of course you're driving quite fast, but everybody points to the rock and says that's Sara's rock. Sara is a Sami name, S, A acute, R, A acute, Sara. So every time a family drives along this road, probably the story of Sarah's rock is told. Sarah was a Sami woman in the 19th century who in the summer, it was in the summer, and the reindeer herds were in the summer pastures, and the men had gone off following the reindeer herds, and Sarah, who was pregnant, was left with an old woman to look after her in her labour. But the old woman died. So this left Sarah more or less on her own. So she came down from the pastures because in the 19th century this road was quite frequently passed by Norwegians, not Sami, Norwegians, in their horses and carts. And she pleaded to be able to, for a ride, to be taken to a friend's house further down, a Sami settlement further down the road. But the good Norwegian burghers ignored her. So she was forced to give birth in the shelter of this. This is a sacred rock. It's a Saedi. And the story that Norwegian children are told is that Sarah cursed the road, and that's why it's the most dangerous road in Norway. So there's a bit of urban myths going on here. But it's really interesting that this Saedi, this stone, and these are stones that in the old days the reindeer herders navigated by, and they are much loved stones. Whether they're sacred stones or not, sometimes some stones have offerings made to them, sometimes. So I'm getting to know these Saedis. I've now visited quite a few. And in some of them you do feel that, well, there's something about this stone. I actually didn't feel anything about Sarah's stone when we visited, but what I was really disconcerted about, and I'm going to point to a bit on the photo that's been institutionally embedded. If you look here, you see that there's a culvert. There's actually a little raised street parapet between the road and its embankment and the stone. And that is a space that you cannot see the bottom of. A road engineer has gone to an enormous amount of trouble to make sure the rock and the road do not touch each other. And that crevice, I suspect, is even vacuumed out because, you know, people put salt and gravel on the road which goes to the side. No one is going to let that crevice fill up. And that to me is a wonderful example of ontological disconcertment. This is money, this is planning, road planning. I mean, road engineers, they blow up rocks at the drop of a hat, literally. So there is something really ontologically disconcerting about this rock in contemporary northern Norway. So what I'm suggesting by including this story is that it's not only faraway countries of which we know little, where ontological disconcertment counts in organisations. It's in every organisation's here and now, and learning how to do concepts as companions, becoming sensitised to ontological disconcertment, is for me a really important part of organisational learning and knowledge. So there's three things I'd like to say in completing my talk, and thanking you for listening. The first is that learning to think of your organisations as clotted knowledge practices and becoming familiar with the fact that your organisation does answer in its being, in its doing as its organisation, a set of 5 epistemic practices is a first step. A second step is really becoming familiar with the concepts that the organisation works with, and learning how to allow an organisation's concepts to enact ontological disconcertment in the workings of an organisation. And thirdly, I'd suggest that a way to begin this is to learn to think of our concepts as companions, as participants in going on together, doing our organisations and keeping them together through their knowledge practices and through our learning. So thank you very much.